The work I'm going to present today is a mix of some work that we started some years ago with Stefan Halgat, and that has been updated since then with other people from the World Bank, in particular Bramka, Jaffino, and Brian Welsh. So there are some older results and some newer results. So hopefully you haven't seen everything already. I have three main points that I want to make in the presentation. The first one, I'm pretty sure you agree with me, given that you've been working on this project, is that GDP is not a sufficient indicator, or even most of the time not a helpful indicator to think about climate change impacts. And I will explain why. The second one is that when we look at 2030 and even 2050, actually, what happens to people in the baseline is the most important driver of future climate change impact. So the uncertainty on future poverty, inequality, and changes in income distribution is much bigger than the uncertainty on climate impacts. And really, the assumptions we make on what's happening to people. I say what happens to people because it's broader than just the number of people in poverty or the income distribution, is really going to drive future vulnerabilities. And then related to that is the fact that these drivers are really context specific. So it's hard to make universal or global scenarios to really represent the space of future vulnerabilities to climate impacts. Now, most of the analysis that exists on climate change impacts focus on GDP, and that's because it's probably easier to do. So you're all well aware of the literature that uses integrated assessment models. Now, this is changing, obviously, including with some of the work from this group that like disaggregates these impacts at the regional level or household level. But integrated assessment models historically have focused on GDP, and then some of the empirical estimates also look at GDP with a huge range of uncertainty on what climate impacts means for GDP. But overall, if you look at assessments that are done with macro models, they all assess climate impacts at a few percent of GDP. And then a big question is whether that matters or not, that climate costs a few percent of GDP. And, you know, when you think about the underlying impacts, for example, you know, like a whole city like New Orleans being flooded in the US, if you look at the cost in comparison to the GDP of the US, you see nothing, but it's still an event that obviously you wouldn't want to avoid in the future. Same for all the health-related risks and the heat-related risks. Yes, they impact labor productivity, but they have much wider impacts and a lot that people would want to avoid, even if the aggregate GDP cost is not so big. And then the other problem is that when we look at global GDP, turns out that it's really unequally distributed, and that, you know, a few percent of global GDP could mean the whole GDP of sub-Saharan Africa. And so again, like if we don't look at the regional distribution of climate impacts, it's really hard to grasp what's happening in the world with climate change. So obviously this is something that you've all been working on, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But this led us at the World Bank to start this work program back in 2015 on the impacts of climate change on poverty and inequality. And so we started doing some modeling work and a publication with Shockwaves that I think was published in 2015. And then a paper in Nature Climate Change with Stefan Halgat. And then since then, we've revised the estimates with Bramka and Brian, and there's a whole new program that's led by Brian Walsh that looks at the micro impact of climate change or of climate policy. But so there were two innovations in the methods that we used and that we keep using. The first one is that we use microsimulation models, and we model the impacts of climate change directly on households instead of going through GDP first. Because you could you could project your households using a macro model, and then you could also put climate change impacts in your macro model and look at how it changes your households in the microsimulation model, but you see nothing if you do that. So instead, we really model the impacts at the household level. And then the other innovation is that we try to really explore the uncertainty in the baseline. So, which is all the assumptions we have to make about what's going to happen to future demographic and socioeconomic changes, even before we look at climate impacts, because obviously climate impacts will be very different in a world where the vulnerabilities are still very much like the ones today in a lot of low income countries, or if people have been lifted out of poverty and have decent living conditions and have access to social protection. So in order to project households in the future in our baselines, we have to make assumptions on structural change, on productivity growth, on demographic changes, on redistribution, and a lot of other parameters. Some of those can come from macro models, but not all of them. And a lot of the parameters are left a bit, to be chosen by the modeler. And in this case, we really try to explore a wide range of scenarios to see how these assumptions actually matter for future vulnerability. So a very quick overview of the method. Most of you are familiar with microsimulation, but so it's a model that's based on household surveys, and the household surveys give us a lot of characteristics about households. So we have a long list of representative households, and in those households, we have the number of children, their age, the education of the parents, which sectors they work on. We also know how representative they are of the overall population through weight, and their income on a base year. The base year, is harmonized across all surveys, but it actually varies from country to country. And then with the microsimulation model, we represent a new snapshot of the population in 2030 or in 2050 with aggregate representations of the population, and then we reweight the household survey. For example, if in our scenario we have more adults that have a certain level of education, more families with fewer children, then we will increase the weight of these households in order to match the new description of the population. And then we also increase the income of each household based on productivity growth in the different sectors they work in, or based on the kind of social transfers that they can receive. And then once we've done that, we add climate change impacts. And here we add climate change impacts through 5 different channels. One is food prices, which in practice reduces the available income for the household based on the share of their income that they spend on food. We decrease productivity in some sectors like agriculture, based on some data that come from other partial equilibrium models. We impact labor productivity for workers that work outside, so that also impacts their income. And then we represent the increased severity of extreme events and what it does to households' income through their assets. And then we also model the cost of increasing prevalence of some diseases like malaria and diarrhea, against through increased consumption on health expenditures and days of work lost. So all of this ends up with a lower income, leads to a lower income in 2030 for some of our households, especially the ones that are the most vulnerable. And if I give you an example of what it looks like, so this is Bangladesh, and this is what the income distribution looks like in the current household survey. And then this is what it looks like in 2030 once we've changed a lot of the parameters in the baseline. And then this is what it looks like with climate change. So here, what's really striking is that the impact of climate change in 2030, even in a pessimistic scenario in terms of impact, is still small compared to the changes that happen in the baseline, to the income distribution. And that's a point I'll come back later on. And then the other thing we see is that nothing happens at the top of the distribution, but a lot more of the changes happen in the middle of the income distribution and at the bottom, where most of the vulnerable people are. So we do that thousands of times for every country, and we end up with a wide range of future income distribution that we represent here by the number of people that are living in extreme poverty in 2030 in our baseline scenarios without climate change. And so we have a few scenarios in which, there's really a reduction in the number of people in extreme poverty by 2030, but also a lot of scenarios where that number is still significant, and much higher than 3% of the population, like the objectives of the World Bank are. But the uncertainty is huge. It's between 150 million and 600 million globally. Now, on top of this, we add climate change impacts. So here, what you see is climate change impacts across all our baseline scenarios. And the green distribution, so both impacts are positive on the number of people in poverty, but the green distribution shows the impact if we use a low climate change impact scenario, and the orange one if we use a high climate change impact scenario. And you see that the impact of climate change goes from, like, on average 37 million people more in extreme poverty if we're optimistic on climate impacts, and more like 100 million if we're pessimistic, with a worst case scenario around 140 million people in extreme poverty in 2030 just because of climate change. That's the order of magnitude of people that fell into poverty globally because of COVID. So it's not negligible. Now, if we look at how these impacts are distributed globally, we see that in absolute numbers, a lot of them are in the countries where there's already a lot of poor people today. So in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, and South Asia, even in Brazil. But then in percent of the existing population, really a lot of the people that fall into poverty because of climate change are in sub-Saharan Africa and in some South Asia countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh. Another important result that we get across all our scenarios and all our countries is that the bottom 40% of the population is more impacted than the average population. Even like around 70% more impacted. And that's because poor people are more exposed and vulnerable to natural disasters. They also spend a higher share of their budget on food, so they're hit harder by the increase in food prices. They're also more likely to work outside and in sectors that are more vulnerable, like agriculture. If we disaggregate the impacts by channel, by type of climate impacts, we see that the most important ones are on food prices and on health. And here, the food prices impacts are really concentrated in countries that are the poorest today, in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. But the health impacts are actually much broader, much more broadly distributed globally. So most regions are impacted in the same way by the health impacts. Now, finally, one of the results that's really important is that if you change the assumptions on the baseline, you end up with much lower impact. So if instead of looking at the full distribution of impacts, we separate between pessimistic scenarios in the baselines with high poverty rates and low and high inequality, and optimistic scenarios in the baselines, we have a huge decrease in climate impacts in 2030. Especially when the climate change impacts are high, with these orange distributions, we have a 50% reduction in the number of people that fall into extreme poverty because of climate change, if we already make more optimistic assumptions in terms of what's happening to poverty in the absence of climate change. And that's a result that's very true in the short run, because we're looking at climate change impacts to 2030 that are relatively limited. In the longer run, there's a much wider uncertainty, and climate change impacts could become really important. But for policy discussion reasons, we focus on the short term, where really What matters is the socioeconomic changes in the next decades. And so what we did with our database of scenarios is try to understand the main drivers of extreme poverty reduction without considering climate change. And that can be done with statistical analysis because we have thousands of scenarios per country. And what we found is that these drivers really depend on the context. So again, in the poorest countries like Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, the assumptions we make on population growth and on the education of the population are really important for future poverty reduction. But in middle-income countries like Brazil, South Africa, China, the main driver of poverty reduction is redistribution, which means that these countries are rich enough to just redistribute their way out of extreme poverty. And then in a few other countries like Ethiopia, Vietnam, what happens in the agriculture sector is actually the main driver of poverty reduction. So that's what we did at the time. Now the work program that's led by Brian Walsh is really digging much deeper into this question of what drives poverty reduction by 2030. And this is an example of work that we did in Peru, where we use the same model to understand how small changes in the assumptions that we make in the model lead to poverty reduction. So what you see on this graph is the elasticity of reduction in poverty to 1% shift in all these variables that are inputs of our models. And what we find is that poverty declines much faster if we expand the number of services, of job services, especially formal ones, if we increase the number of formal jobs in Peru, and if we increase the number of people with high school attainment. On the other side, poverty increases if we make assumptions on the shift towards more jobs in agriculture or more informality. And that's important because it helps us then identify the parameters that matter most for our baseline scenarios. And then what we do also is that we look at how different groups respond to different kinds of climate shocks. So for example, we look at how different farmers how poverty in the country changes if we shock the productivity of farmers on the coast or in Lima versus farmers that work in the Amazon and in the Andes. And we find that the farmers that work in the Amazon or the Andes, if their earnings are decreased because of an impact on their productivity, this leads to a much higher increase in poverty in the country than if you shock the income of the farmers on the coast. That's because the farmers in the Andes and in the Amazon are much poorer already. So you have a larger number of people that will fall into poverty if you have a shock in the agriculture sector. On the other hand, if you shock food prices, you see that you will have a higher impact on poverty if you shock food prices for the people who live in Lima or on the coast than people who live in the Amazon or in the Andes, because people in Lima are much more vulnerable to an increase in food prices. And by the way, just to come back to my initial point, we also did a test where we link our microsimulation model with a macro model that's called MF mode, that's a macrostructural model. And we looked at what happened if we represent the same shocks in the macro model and then use that to shock the household model, and basically we see nothing, because the macro model is just going to absorb this shock and do some readjustments. And then the parameters that go into the microsimulation model are barely changed, so we see no impact on poverty. So let me stop here. I think I'm at the end of my 20 minutes, and I will leave you with my 3 main messages. Thank you.